Welcome back. I know that was just the beginning of a chat, but hopefully you were able to touch base. I'm now going to transition us into the next part of our agenda. We have invited, the executive committee invited two longtime members of INTRAC and very accomplished researchers to share what we called a life presentation, which is to give us an overview of their program of research and the thoughts that they've had along the way. These are going to be relatively brief presentations, but in order to try to get some dialogue going, we want to invite you to use the chat. So if you can open your group chat window, I guess is how it's called, Adrian, then I will be moderating. And once we've heard from our two speakers, I'll be asking questions on your behalf. So we'll see if we can get some discussion going in that way. So it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce to you our first speaker, who is Mark Courtney from the University of Chicago. His fields of special interest are child welfare policy and services, the connection between child welfare services and other institutions serving families living in poverty, the transition to adulthood for marginalized populations, and the professionalization of social work. Sorry, I realized I'm speaking quite quickly. Before moving into academia, Mark worked for several years in various capacities, frontline capacities actually, providing group home care to abused and neglected adolescents. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Varda. While Adrian gets the slides up, I just say hi to everybody, and I just have one comment. Known Emily since 2003, that first meeting, and early on she said she was happy to see some old faces. You know, older members of the community, folks I've known for a while. It's early here. My face probably looks old, but
my apologies, Mark. Anyway, consolation, we're affectionately all known as grandparents, so I'm a grandparent in that context.
Fair enough. That works. That works. Anyway, are you going to put my slides up, Adrian?
I'm going to do that. I'm also going to ask everyone to please switch off their cameras. If you don't switch it off, I'm going to switch it off for you, which means you can't switch it back on again. So we really do need everyone please to switch off your cameras. It just helps with reducing the data load, and particularly those of us coming from the Global South, data is a little bit heavy. Give me just a mo and I'll be with you now, Mark.
Sure. I'll turn mine off too.
You can leave yours on, you're the speaker.
Okay, all right.
It's your prerogative.
Yes, please do, Mark.
Okay.
There we go.
Great. Okay, so that's the bottom line here is I've been doing research on young people aging out of foster care, with the term we use in the United States, for about over 25 years now. Next slide. And, you know, why do I do that? So first of all, you can just hit the thing a few times. So, you know, why study youth in foster care? So for me, it's quite personal. I was studying to be a clinical psychologist, and I did an interview and ended up working in group care with teenagers, many of whom aged out of the system in California, where I worked back in the late 1980s. I lived and worked in group care for about 5 years. And then since then, I worked for about 25 years with folks in the public and voluntary sector side, really studying and trying to understand all aspects of the public child welfare system here. I've done research on adoption, family reunification, child maltreatment prevention, the juvenile courts, et cetera. But because I spent a lot of time and watched many young people age out of the system in California, and you know, see how difficult that was for many of them, it's been something that I've continued to study. My studies have always involved youth with care experience. So I've had young people on my teams who were adopted or who spent time in foster care, several of them. And my studies have been designed in collaboration generally with foster youth organizations in the states that I operate in. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through the studies that I've been involved in. I've been involved in other studies, used other types of data, but I think what I'm most known for and the work that has been the most influential and the most enjoyable have been a series of panel studies, longitudinal studies, and then more recently, experimental evaluation. So I started, my first academic job was at the University of Wisconsin starting in 1993. And within a couple of years with the state of Wisconsin, I launched a study called the Foster Youth Transitions to Adulthood Study. And, you know, we just had one wave of follow-up, but we started with a, you know, at that time, relatively large number of young people. And we're able to follow up about 4/5 of them. And what we were really able to do with that study is describe these young people and describe their experiences in care and their outcomes about a year to a year and a half after leaving care. That study contributed to a change in policy in the United States called the Chafee Foster Care Independence Act in recognition of the increased the needs that the young people had in my study and a couple of earlier studies. Working with the folks in Wisconsin, I was able to enlist a couple of other states, Illinois and Iowa, in a study we refer to as the Midwest study that followed young people for a longer period of time and was able to compare outcomes for those young people between the states. Illinois at that time allowed young people to remain in care till 21, while the other two states, which was typical at the time, discharge young people from care at age 18. To make a long story short, that study provided pretty strong evidence that if you allow young people to remain in care, first of all, most of them would choose to do so until well past their 18th birthday, and that was associated with a number of benefits. The third longitudinal study is something I'm currently involved in called CalYouth, California Youth Transitions to Adulthood Study. This study took place in California, takes place in California, which was one of the first states to implement a change in federal policy that allowed states to extend foster care to 21. That federal policy was influenced by that earlier study, the Midwest study, showing the benefits of that. As you can see, for both the Midwest study and CalYouth, we've been able to follow over 4/5 of young people from when they were in care until several years later. And in both studies, we've been able to follow young people past the age of 21. So we've been able to see how they're doing past that point in time. The other thing we've done with these studies is that we've been able to link them with administrative records, which has proven to be quite useful. So records of things like post-secondary educational attainment, employment, involvement with the criminal justice system. As I suspect all of you, or certainly many of you know, we have a very punitive criminal justice system in this country, and young people who are leaving care are involved in that at way too high a rate. But those data sources become quite valuable for topics where social desirability is an issue. Folks may not give you honest answers, but also where you can't find young people. So we're able to look at some of those outcomes despite that. And then lastly, I would say that my research has evolved from that first study, which is descriptive of outcomes, to the second and third study where we're examining risk and protective factors associated with later outcomes. And then the other thing I've done since about 2001 is involved in hopefully rigorous evaluations of programs and policies directed toward youth aging out of foster care. Done some evaluations that show that some things don't appear to work, they don't appear to be very helpful, whereas some other things are. So those are basically the studies I've been involved in, and then I want to conclude, I think in less than my time, by pointing out that a real pleasure of this kind of research program where I've been able to involve myself in long studies that go on for years, and that are large studies. They cover a wide range of topics. They have large samples. is I've had great collaborators. And so this list, I just want to honor just the PhD students, make a shout out to PhD students. The INTRAC has been very supportive of doctoral students around the world. And I've been blessed to have worked with all these people, all of whom were doctoral students of mine, and are now either working at research institutions like Chapin Hall, which I served as director for a while, or the vast majority of them are now professors, many of them already tenured themselves. And that's been a real privilege. And I think it's a tribute to these kinds of large studies. There's things that, advantages to large studies is you can have big teams of folks. Right now I have a team that involves assistant professors at 3 different universities, 2 doctoral students, and 2 master's students. And that's fairly typical of the research teams I worked on, certainly for the last 15 years. They've always had multiple folks. And as time goes on, I have colleagues who used to be my students who are now my peers and collaborators. I have lots of other collaborators and co-investigators, including folks in INTRAC. So I'll be quiet now and let Rowan tell her story, and then we'll have some time for back and forth.
Thank you, Mark. I see we already have questions for Mark in the chat, so please keep sending your questions. I'm keeping track. We have time now for questions. We've had a lot of questions, and I'll try to do them justice. We won't have enough time for everyone's questions. I just want to say that there were a lot of very positive comments, both Mark and Rowan, and people are clearly very inspired by what you're doing. So I'm going to start off by asking some questions of Mark, some general questions. The first question, Mark, is someone was asking, what would you say your headline learning has been in terms of methodology? What would you share with the group today?
Well, I would say my headline learning in terms of methodology is that we need all the methods we have. I happen to have used some methods more than others, but I think that's a function partly of the kinds of questions I asked early on, really trying to describe with some level of precision how young people were doing, their perceptions of services, things like that. You can't do that with much precision without using large samples. That you just can't. I mean, you can learn a lot, but not that. In terms of impacts of particular kinds of interventions, you can learn a lot, but again, there are particular methods, we get into that, experimental methods and some quasi-experimental methods that are more rigorous than others. That just had to do with the questions I was asking, and as my career progressed, my ability to mount studies that other people didn't have the ability to mount, right? But I think, again, I would come back to, I made notes about that, I saw that question. I think we have questions that need to be answered that can only be answered with qualitative methods. We have questions that can only be answered with ethnographic methods. So the fact that I've used particular methods, large sample longitudinal studies, experimental methods in most of the research I described in my presentation doesn't mean that that's the only work that needs to be done. I think, in fact, my first study was an N of 4 that took me a lot. I spent a lot of time with 4 people. So I think that there's a range of things.
Okay, terrific. Well, you've mentioned this issue of large samples, and a number of people were asking questions about how did you access those samples, how did you manage them, and also how did you leverage the funding for those kinds of huge studies?
Sure. So I would say that, first of all, it helps to be in a country with over 300 million people, right? So, I mean, a lot of members of INTRAC are just not in jurisdictions that have populations the size that we have. So a little humility is in order here for anybody in the US or, big, post-industrial democracies with, 400,000 children in foster care. So that's a big part of it. I would say the other thing with relationship to funding, sample size, there's also questions around attrition. That's a kind of different question. But I think grounding in the field, to be honest. And I would say that that's true for my ability to get these big studies off the ground and keep them going. It's true with respect to the question around how do you influence policy with your research. I think to be really grounded in the field of practice in terms of your knowledge of that field of practice, so that that shows to practitioners, to policymakers, et cetera, to understanding the questions that come from the field. All of my studies came out of questions that were pressing questions in the field. That's sort of where I started. And so I've always spent a lot of time, and people who work on my teams are like, how do you, like 100,000 miles of flying mainly within the US to be in contact with practitioners, policymakers, et cetera, so that when there are important questions to be answered, they have some faith in my team's ability to do that, and that we'll be transparent about it, we'll engage with people, et cetera. So there's a long conversation there, but I think that has to do with where my funding comes from. I tend to start with money from state or local government to help them answer questions important to them. Philanthropy throws in funding, but I have that buy-in of the institutions. So philanthropy is more inclined to give me or others money if they feel like you have a connection to public institutions that are in the long run actually going to carry out policy, services, et cetera. And on that foundation, we've been able to get federal money from more traditional funding sources, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, things like that. I've never really started with those funders. I've always started with connections with the field in terms of questions, funding, et cetera, and then build on that.
Okay. You mentioned, the close connection to practice. Someone asked a question about theoretical frameworks. Have there been any theoretical frameworks that have guided your work, Mark?
Yeah, but I would say I'm not somebody who starts with theory. I start with the questions that the field has. Sometimes the field's questions aren't as honed as they could be because there's a theory implicit in those questions and they're not thinking about that. But I mean, I've used theory of human capital theory, social capital theory, psychological theories, sociological theories. I mean, it really depends on the nature of the question and the nature of the data we can get, right? I mean, some kinds of theories require large sample data. Others really require much more qualitative investigation. And, there I think I've provided opportunities for qualitative researchers work, Gina Samuels, for example, folks who have done, Colleen Carey did some work that was more qualitative. So I don't lead with theory. I'm not out there trying to develop a theory. It's more what theory is going to help me answer the questions that I have. And then sometimes that evolves into a theory building process.
Okay.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because that's actually one of the critiques in the literature on leaving care is that there's not enough theory-based literature, but I start out like Mark, and it's really the findings of each wave that really give me a good idea about what I need to ask next, because it follows the development of the young people.
Okay. I was going to ask Mark one last question before moving on to you, Roanne. Mark, is there one last message you'd like to leave the group with today? We have a lot of people with us who are just starting out in their research career or who are working in practice, and any message you'd like to leave them with?
I would say, particularly because this audience, INTRAC, I mean, find collaborators, right? I mean, the reason I had that last slide there is sometimes people think, wow, he did this great program research, he did it all on his own. That's absolutely not true. And I think, I've benefited more from my collaborators over the years, doctoral students among them, but not just doctoral students, than I have from all the money that I've gotten or connections to government or whatever. And actually the money I've gotten connections wouldn't have happened without those collaborators. So I think INTRAC is, particularly when you're in smaller countries, the opportunity to ask a question with colleagues across different contexts is phenomenally powerful. And it also means you're not alone, right? So you have folks you're working with. So I guess I would close with that.
Okay, thank you.